When Judith slid the folder across the Christmas table, she did it with the kind of smile people use when they've already decided the outcome. The folder was cream, expensive looking, with my name written across the tab in neat black print. "Before dessert," she said, lifting her wineglass and glancing around the table like she was hosting a board meeting instead of Christmas dinner, "there's just one small family matter to settle." 21 people were seated in my dining room, beneath the chandelier I had chosen, beside the fireplace I paid to restore, around the walnut table I bought after working weekends for 6 months straight, and yet somehow, in that moment, I felt like a guest in my own house. Judith pushed a gold pen toward me. "If you really love my son," she said, her voice soft enough to sound reasonable and sharp enough to cut skin, "you'll sign the house over tonight." The room went silent in that ugly, greedy way silence does when people know something cruel is happening and decide to stay seated anyway. I looked at Daniel, my husband, expecting confusion, alarm, anything. He lowered his eyes to his plate. That hurt more than Judith's words. Then, from the far end of the table, I heard the quiet click of a glass being set down. My father, who had spent most of the evening ignored by Judith's side of the family, unfolded his napkin, looked at the folder once, and said in the calmest voice in the room, "I don't think anyone should sign anything until I've had a chance to read what your mother is calling a small family matter." Judith turned to him with a thin, dismissive smile. "And you are." My father held her stare for exactly 2 seconds, too long. "Arthur Hale," he said, "though if you were paying attention to your own family paperwork, Judith, you might know me as the attorney who wrote half of it." And just like that, Christmas dinner stopped being her performance. It became mine. I wish I could say that moment came out of nowhere. It didn't. By the time Judith placed those papers in front of me, she had spent nearly 3 years teaching me how little room there was in her world for a woman who owned something her son did not. When I met Daniel Whitmore, he was the easiest person in any room to love. He listened carefully. He remembered tiny details. He called when he said he would. On our 3rd date, I told him I hated men who treated kindness like a trick, and he smiled and said, "That makes 2 of us." At 36, I wasn't looking for drama or rescue. I had already built a life that felt solid. I was an interior designer, not famous, not glamorous, just good, reliable clients, quiet reputation, enough work to pay my bills, save carefully, and, after my mother died, put her small insurance payout together with everything I had and buy the old cedar-sided house on Maple Ash Lane. It wasn't huge. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. My mother had loved old houses. She used to say they felt like people who had survived enough winters to stop pretending. The first time Daniel saw it, he stood in the doorway with both hands in his coat pockets and said, "This place feels like you." No one had ever said something so simple and gotten it so right. When we got married 18 months later, Daniel moved into my house, not ours yet, not on paper, mine. That detail mattered to my father, who was an estate and real estate attorney and believed romance was wonderful right up until someone ignored documentation. At the closing, long before I ever met Daniel, my father had made sure the house was titled correctly. Separate property, clean records, protective language, no ambiguity. When Daniel and I married, Dad asked one quiet question over coffee. "Are you planning to retitle the property?" "No," I said. He nodded once. Good. That was the entire speech. My father was not dramatic. He was not controlling. He didn't interfere. He just believed that love and paperwork were both honest when done properly. Judith, of course, believed something very different. I met her a week after Daniel proposed. She wore cream cashmere, and the expression of a woman who had spent her life pretending judgment was simply discernment in better jewelry. She hugged me lightly, looked over my shoulder at the restaurant mirror, and asked whether my business was steady enough to remain fulfilling. I remember smiling and saying, "It pays my mortgage, if that's what you mean." That was the first time I saw the flicker in her eyes, not offense, not curiosity. Calculation. After the wedding, Judith began referring to my house in strange little ways that I tried, for too long, to dismiss. At Daniel's place, at the kids' house, at my son's home. Sometimes she said it in front of people. Sometimes she said it like a joke. Once, at brunch, she told one of her friends, "Elena has such lovely taste. She made Daniel's house almost livable." I corrected her gently. "My house." She laughed and squeezed my hand. "Of course, darling. For now." Daniel heard it. He always heard it. He would kiss my temple later and say, "You know how she is." I grew to hate that sentence. You know how she is, as if a person's patterns were somehow easier to live with just because they were predictable. Judith didn't scream. She curated pressure. She brought over curtains I hadn't asked for and said the guest room needed to feel more Whitmore. She rearranged my kitchen while pretending to help with Easter lunch. That she once opened a cabinet, looked at the everyday dishes my mother had bought at a second-hand market, and asked, "Do you keep these for sentimental reasons?" I said yes. She said, "How brave." Even then, I could have handled her if Daniel had stood beside me clearly, but Daniel had a habit I didn't understand until much later. He thought peace was the same thing as the absence of confrontation. If Judith insulted me, he'd smooth the moment instead of naming it. If she overstepped, he'd distract instead of defend. If I told him I felt erased in my own home, he'd hold me in bed and whisper, "You're overthinking her. She just wants to feel included." The truth was simpler. She wanted ownership without earning it, and Daniel wanted the comfort of being loved by both of us without paying the costs of disappointing either one. The first real crack in my marriage appeared 2 Decembers before that Christmas dinner. Daniel had left his laptop open in the den. I wasn't snooping. I was bringing him tea. An email thread was open between him and Judith. The subject line read, "Home equity options." I stood there longer than I should have, staring. Judith had sent 3 names of lenders. Daniel had replied, "If Alina agrees to transfer title first, the process will be much easier." I remember my whole body going cold, not angry, not yet, just cold. When I asked him that night, Daniel said I was taking it out of context. He said they were only discussing possibilities for future planning. He said his mother worried about asset structure because his brother Owen's business had collapsed and the family was nervous about exposure. "What exposure?" I asked. He rubbed his face. "It's complicated," then uncomplicated it. He sat down across from me at the kitchen island and said, "Owen has debt. Mom is afraid some of the family investments might get dragged into litigation. She thinks consolidating things inside the Whitmore Trust could protect everyone." "Everyone," I repeated. "Or just the Whit—" He exhaled slowly. "You're my wife. That includes you." "No," I said, my voice shaking more from disappointment than rage. "It includes what I own." He apologized that night, thoroughly, tenderly. He said he had handled it badly. He said nothing would happen without my agreement. I believed him because I wanted to. That was the hardest truth I had to face later, not that Judith underestimated me, but that I kept overestimating Daniel. Over the next year, the pressure stopped being subtle. Judith began floating the idea publicly. At a summer barbecue, she told her sister-in-law in front of me, it would just be smarter for the house to sit with the family. Young marriages need structure. At Thanksgiving, she leaned across my own counter and said, "Separate property creates emotional distance. You don't want Daniel feeling like a tenant." Daniel, who had never paid a mortgage on that house. Daniel, whose favorite chair sat exactly where my mother's reading chair had once been. Daniel, who never seemed to notice what it cost me to make room for him, while his family kept trying to move me out of my own life. The worst part was how respectable Judith made all of it sound. She never said, "Give us your house." She said, "Protect the marriage." She said, "Plan for the future." She said, "Create unity." I started hearing those phrases the way people hear footsteps outside a locked door. One evening in early December, 3 weeks before Christmas, I walked into the laundry room and heard Judith's voice coming from Daniel's phone on speaker. They hadn't heard me yet. "She'd do it if the timing is right," Judith said. "Not privately. She gets stubborn when she feels cornered, one-on-one. Do it when the family is there. Make it about trust." My hand froze on the doorframe. Daniel said nothing for a second. Then, "I don't want a scene." Judith gave a small laugh. "Then, don't let her create one." I left the room before either of them saw me, but something inside me had shifted. Until then, I had still been trying to preserve the marriage I thought I had. After that, I started preparing for the marriage I actually had. I called my father the next morning. I didn't tell him everything, not at first. I just asked if he still had the original file from my closing. He was quiet for a beat. "Yes, can I come by?" Of course, my father's office had shrunk since retirement into 2 rooms above a dry cleaner downtown, but it still smelled like cedar shelves, printer ink, and black coffee. He pulled my file from a cabinet with the kind of calm efficiency that made disaster feel manageable. We sat side by side at his desk while he went through the documents. "The house is clean," he said. Titled to you as separate property, acquired before marriage, with traceable funds. Daniel signed an acknowledgement after the wedding confirming no ownership interest was created by occupancy or routine shared expenses. You're protected. I looked at him. If someone tried to pressure me into transferring it, he closed the file. Then, I'd advise you not to. Legally, emotionally too. I should have told him then about the emails, the speakerphone call, the years of small humiliations. Instead, I said, would you come to Christmas? He knew me well enough not to press ... Yes, he said. That is how my father ended up at the table that night in a charcoal sweater and wire-rimmed glasses, looking less like a man who had represented 3 generations of wealthy families and more like a retired professor someone's aunt had politely forgotten to include in the seating plan. Judith barely acknowledged him when he arrived. She air-kissed my cheek, complimented the roast, and told me she had placed my father at the far end because the conversation at our end tends to get a bit technical. I almost laughed. If she had known who she was seating there, she might have cancelled Christmas entirely. The evening itself started with the usual performance, candles lit, crystal polished, Owen, already drinking too much, Daniel tense in the jaw, Judith in emerald silk, moving through my kitchen as if she were queen of a country she had recently annexed. I hosted because I always hosted, because I knew how to stage warmth, even when I no longer felt safe inside it. At one point, while I was carrying out the potatoes, I caught my reflection in the dark window above the sink. My face looked composed, my shoulders looked elegant, only my eyes told the truth. By the time everyone sat down, I already knew something was coming. Judith was too pleased. She waited until the second course had been cleared. Then she tapped her spoon lightly against her glass. I won't keep everyone long, she said, which is what people say right before they absolutely do. This family has been talking for a while about long-term planning, given the changing market, Daniel and Elena's next chapter, and the importance of keeping major assets properly structured. I set my fork down. Across from me, Daniel didn't lift his head. Judith reached beside her chair and produced the cream folder. This is simply a deed transfer into the Whitmore family trust, she said. A formality, really, sensible, protective. Arthur, she nodded vaguely toward my father without looking at him fully. I'm sure even you can appreciate the value of proper paperwork. A few people gave the polite, uncomfortable chuckle of cowards trying to keep dinner intact. She slid the folder toward me. There's no reason to delay, she said. We're all family here. I looked around the table. Owen watched with open curiosity. Daniel's cousin, Melissa, looked mortified but said nothing. Judith's friend Celeste, who somehow ended up at every major holiday despite not being related to anyone, leaned forward like she was at the theater. Then Judith added the line, I think she had been saving all month. If you truly see yourself as a Whitmore, Alina, you won't insist on standing apart. That was the point, not the house, not even the trust. Submission. She wanted me to prove belonging by surrendering what made me independent. I opened the folder. First page was exactly what she claimed and not at all what she claimed. A quitclaim deed, transfer language, attached trust reference, supplemental acknowledgement. But there were things she hadn't expected me to notice. A blank section, a rushed a description that went further than simple transfer. It allowed downstream encumbrance under trustee discretion. In plain language, once the house was in the trust, it could be leveraged. My fingers went cold around the paper. So, that was it. They didn't just want symbolic control, they wanted access. I turned one page further and saw Daniel's signature already on one of the attached acknowledgements. Pre-signed. My husband had signed before I ever saw the papers. I think something in my face changed then, because my father looked up sharply from his seat. Judith mistook my silence for pressure working. She smiled. I know public signing can feel emotional, dear, but sometimes family decisions need witnesses. My father spoke before I could. I agree, he said. Witnesses can be extremely useful. For the first time all evening, every eye at the table turned fully toward him. Judith leaned back with a patient expression people use on the elderly when they think confusion is about to happen. My father held out his hand. May I? I passed him the folder. He adjusted his glasses, read the first page, then the second, then the trust reference. His expression never changed. That frightened Judith more than anger would have. Finally, he set the papers down with care. This is badly drafted, he said. Judith gave a brittle laugh. It was prepared by a firm we've used for years. I'm sure it was, my father said, though the trust language they're leaning on is mine. The silence after that was physical. Judith's smile faltered. Excuse me. Arthur looked at her directly. The Whitmore Family Preservation Trust was revised 11 years ago after George Whitmore's tax issue with the Vermont property. I wrote that revision. I also wrote the anti-commingling clause your current preparer either ignored or hoped Alina would never understand. Daniel lifted his head. Owen said, very softly, oh hell. Judith recovered first. Even if that were true, it is, my father said. He reached into the inside pocket of his sweater, not dramatically, just practically, and pulled out a pair of folded reading notes and a business card holder. From it, he slid an old cream card across the table. Arthur Hale and Mercer, Estates and Property Council. Judith stared at it as if the card itself had insulted her. My father continued, asterisk, you cannot simply fold outside separate property into that trust without informed consent, full disclosure, and trustee compliance. More importantly, this property was purchased by my daughter before marriage with traceable separate funds. Daniel acknowledged that in writing. Any attempt to pressure transfer under false framing would be very easy to challenge. Judith's face tightened. No one is pressuring anyone. My father glanced at the room. 21 witnesses at Christmas dinner, he said, a pre-signed acknowledgement from the spouse. Repeated framing around marital loyalty. I suspect a court might view that differently. I looked at Daniel. He looked sick. Good. Judith tried one last angle. This was only meant to protect the family from unnecessary exposure. My father turned a page and tapped the addendum. You mean from Owen's pending commercial liability matter? Owen went pale. Mom, Judith snapped, stay out of this. But it was too late. My father, still calm, said, this supplemental language allows the trustees to borrow against contributed real property. If Alina signed tonight, her house could be used in service of liabilities that are not hers. That is not family planning. That is asset capture dressed as sentiment. No one moved. The candles crackled. Outside, snow was starting to fall against the black windows. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears, and, beneath it, something even stronger. Relief. Not because I had been rescued, because the thing I had known in my bones for so long was finally standing in the center of the room where no one could call it misunderstanding anymore. Judith looked at Daniel then, as if silently ordering him to fix it. He swallowed. Alina, I was going to explain. No, I said, but my voice came out steadier than I felt. You were going to let me be humiliated in my own house until I caved. That's not fair. I actually laughed, one short, disbelieving breath. Not fair. You signed paperwork about my house before I ever saw it. He stood up too quickly, knocking his water glass, because if I'd brought it to you alone, you would have shut it down. Asterisk, yes, I said, because it's my house. That landed harder than anything else I said that night. Not the legal language, not the exposure. That one sentence, because it named the truth no one in his family had ever accepted, my house. Judith's eyes flashed. You keep saying that as if marriage means nothing. I turned to her fully. No, I keep saying it because you've spent 3 years trying to erase it. Her mouth tightened. You never truly became part of this family. And there it was. The thing beneath all the polished words. I wasn't family because I would not surrender power. I wasn't accepted because I arrived with a life that didn't require their permission. I set my napkin down beside my plate. You're right, I said quietly. I didn't. The room froze again. I stood, took the folder from my father, and closed it. I married Daniel. I said, I did not join a board of directors. I did not agree to public tests of loyalty. I did not spend years renovating this home, hosting your holidays, absorbing your insults, and making space for all of you just to be ambushed into handing over my property because your son was too weak to ask me honestly and you were too entitled to hear no. Judith rose too, color flaring in her cheeks. How dare you speak to me like that in front of my family? I looked around my dining room at the people who had eaten my food, used my bathrooms, complimented my table settings, and watched me be cornered, in front of mine too. I said, that made Melissa cry. Not loudly, just enough to remind everyone a line had been crossed so completely there was no walking it back. Neil moved toward me. Can we please do this privately? No, I said. You wanted witnesses. He flinched. My father remained seated, hands folded, saying nothing now. He didn't need to. He had given me the ground. What I did with it had to be mine. Daniel tried again, softer this time. I was trying to protect us. I stared at him. Us from what? He opened his mouth, closed it because that was always his problem. He spoke most fluently when the truth could stay blurred. So Owen, drunk enough to stop being loyal, answered for him. Mom promised if the house went into the trust, George would release more capital, he muttered. Daniel's project is upside down. Mine too. They needed liquidity. The room detonated in whispers. George Whitmore, Daniel's estranged father, the keeper of the old family money, the man Judith still blamed for every private humiliation of her adult life, had apparently set conditions. No clean title movement, no additional family funds, and Judith, rather than accept that, had decided my home was the simpler solution. I looked at Daniel again, but this time I wasn't looking for remorse. I was measuring damage. Your project, I said. Is that what this was really about? He ran a hand through his hair. It was temporary. That word. Temporary. As if betrayal became harmless. If you imagined returning what you took, but my chest ached so sharply I had to press my palm against the table for a second. Then I straightened. Pack a bag tonight, I said. Tomorrow you can collect the rest. Judith let out a sharp, offended laugh. You can't be serious. I turned to her. In case there's any confusion left, I said, I am very serious. Daniel will not spend another night in this house until I decide otherwise. And you, I looked down at the folder, will never bring paperwork into my home again. She took a step forward. You vindictive little Judith, my father said, not loud, just final. She stopped. I've thought about that moment many times since, not because he raised his voice, he-d-i-d-n, single quotes T, that because some people spend their entire lives mistaking gentleness for lack of force. My father had never needed volume to be obeyed. Judith lifted her chin and grabbed her purse. This is not over, Dad answered before I could. Oh, I believe it is, he said, unless you'd like to continue discussing attempted coercive transfer in front of this many witnesses. Her face changed then, not to guilt, but to fear. That was enough for me. People began standing awkwardly, chairs scraped, coats were found. Celeste left without dessert, which remains one of the small comforts I allow myself. Melissa hugged me in the hallway and whispered, I'm sorry, like an apology from the sidelines could repair what silence had helped create. Owen avoided my eyes entirely. Judith left last from her side of the family, sweeping through the foyer in wounded outrage, still trying to carry herself, like the injured party. Daniel stayed where he was until the front door closed behind the last guest. Only then did he look at me like I was his wife again, instead of the obstacle at the center of a financial plan. Alina, he said, voice raw now, please. My father stood up slowly. I'll be in the den, he said, and walked out, closing the door behind him. That was another thing he understood. Sometimes support means stepping out before pain gets rewritten as negotiation. Daniel moved closer. I never wanted it to happen like this. I was exhausted enough to tell the whole truth, without softening it. That's the problem, Daniel. Things were always happening around you, and you kept acting like that meant you weren't responsible. He shook his head. I made mistakes. You built a trap with your mother and hoped love would make me step into it quietly. That's not what It is exactly what you did. He looked around the dining room then, at the dishes, the candles burned low, the untouched pie on the sideboard, the home I had spent years making warm enough for people who kept trying to make me smaller inside it. I was desperate, he said, and there it was, finally. Something honest, not enough, but honest. For money, I asked. For everything, he said. For her approval, for the project, for this image of being enough. My anger shifted then, not into forgiveness, into clarity. Daniel had not betrayed me because he was evil. He betrayed me because he was hollow imprecisely, the place integrity should have lived. And men like that can be more dangerous than openly cruel people, because they will let worse people use them and call it helplessness. I took off my wedding ring and set it beside the folder. I hope one day you become enough for yourself, I said. But you don't get to build that at my expense, he cried then. I did not because I was stronger, because by then, I was done asking pain to prove anything. He packed a bag in silence while my father sat in the den, reading an old hardcover he had taken from my shelf as if he were waiting for a train, instead of guarding the edge of my life. When Daniel left, he paused with his hand on the front door. Did you ever love me? He asked. It was such a desperate question, and under different circumstances maybe I would have answered gently. Instead I said, enough to tell the truth for both of us, longer than I should have. Then I closed the door. Afterward, the house was very quiet. My father helped me clear the table. He wrapped leftovers, rinsed plates, wiped the counter where the folder had sat. He did not offer speeches. He did not say, I told you so. At 1 in the morning, while snow thickened outside and the kitchen finally looked like itself again, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. When your mother was sick, he said, she made me promise never to confuse protecting you with controlling you. My eyes filled for the first time that night. He kept going. So I have tried very hard to let you live your life, without interference. But I need you to hear this now. Being loved should not require surrendering the ground under your feet. I looked down at the steam rising from my cup. I think I knew that, I whispered. I just didn't want it to be true. He nodded. That's often how truth arrives. Daniel texted the next day, then called, then emailed. He wanted counseling, context, grace. Another version of the story where panic and family pressure explained enough to make reconciliation noble. I read every message once. Then I sent one reply. When you were asked to choose between my trust and your mother's approval, you chose quickly. I am simply honoring that decision. After that, I directed communication through attorneys. Not because I was trying to punish him, because I was finished living in blurred lines. Judith tried twice more. First through a voicemail, so polished it almost sounded maternal. Then through a handwritten note claiming Christmas had become emotionally overheated and suggesting women sometimes misunderstand financial language when under stress. My father laughed out loud at that one, which, if you had known him, would tell you just how absurd it was. Her lawyer reached out once as well, casually fishing to see whether I intended to make any formal allegations regarding coercion. My father drafted the response, short, clean, precise, no threats, no theater. Just enough fact to remind them that silence had been my generosity, not their protection. In February, I filed for divorce. Daniel did not contest the property issue. He couldn't, not legally, and certainly not after the Christmas witnesses. The marriage ended not with a dramatic courtroom collapse, but with signatures in a quiet office and a sense, as I stepped back into the cold spring air, that grief and freedom sometimes occupy the same breath. The house changed after that, not physically at first, it just exhaled. Rooms I hadn't realized where tense began to feel still again. I moved Daniel's chair out of the den. I brought my mother's reading chair back from the guest room storage corner, where I had exiled it to make space for his taste. I repainted the dining room 6 months later in a soft mineral gray that made the winter light look kind instead of hard. I stopped hosting holidays for people who thought access was affection. The next Christmas, it was just me, my father, Melissa, and her teenage daughter, who admitted over roasted carrots that she had never seen an adult woman end a bad situation without apologizing for it. I told her it had taken me longer than I wanted. She said, still counts. She was right. A week after New Year's, I found an old photograph tucked into one of my mother's cookbooks. I was 13 in it, standing on the front steps of a rental we lived in before life steadied. My mother had her arm around my shoulders. My father was beside us, younger, already looking a little tired from all the work adulthood asks of good people. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 7 words, build what no one can take kindly. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried then, finally and fully, not for Daniel, not even for the marriage. If I'm honest, I cried for the years I had spent translating disrespect into misunderstanding because I thought endurance was the price of being chosen. It isn't. The truth is, Judith was wrong about me from the beginning. I was never standing apart from her family because I was cold or proud or unwilling to belong. I was standing apart because I already understood something she never did. A home is not the place where people demand proof of love from you. A home is the place where love does not need to seize power to feel secure. And that Christmas, while she was busy sliding papers across my table like a queen awarding terms, she forgot the one thing women like her always forget. Some of us were raised by people who taught us that dignity is not a mood, it is a boundary. So no, I did not sign. I served the roast. I heard the truth. I watched the mask drop. And when the night was over, the house was still mine. Not because I had been lucky, Because I finally stopped mistaking endurance for peace, silence for kindness, and marriage for surrender. Judith wanted a signature. What she got was a witness. Daniel wanted time. What he got was consequence. And me, I got my life back in the room where they thought I would hand it over. That remains my favorite part. Not that they lost, that I did not